Hey everyone. As I've been doing these videos over the past couple of months, and by the way, thanks to everyone who has subscribed to the channel, commented, liked my comment, shared it, given me feedback directly. It's been great and has me excited to continue to make more of this stuff, which is, why I'm here, what I'm doing today. So anyway, as I've been getting back into the swing of making comic related content, on a regular basis, I've been going through some of the projects on my blog, as well as the church pedigree list, and updating content there to include sales in the past 2 or 3 years where I was in hibernation. This video and then a series that will follow over the next couple of months will be inspired by that work. This first video will take a look at my timeline of world record comic book sales, and there's an associated visualization. This project does what it says on the tin. It tracks the progression of the world record comic book sale price from the mid-1960s through to the present day. This work, like much of what I do, wouldn't have been possible without the research and help of many people on the CGC forums. A version of this timeline, which basically covers the pre-2000s books, formed the foundation of this work, and that was on the forum. As I'll mention later, and actually I mentioned in a short video, up until recently, both that list and my subsequent list and timeline, the one presented here, had an error. I'll talk about that in depth because it illustrates something interesting about the early history of the hobby and the relative importance of Marvel Comics #1 and Action 1. And in addition, I've actually uncovered a couple of other sales that were not previously recorded on this timeline. As with all of the projects I do, with the exception of the stuff that's kind of in the CGC era, which is easier to track, some of the stuff is really difficult to pin down. I don't have exact sale dates for some of these things. I don't necessarily know the seller or the buyer, which continues to the present day, but for different reasons. And, there's always holes in the data. So I'll say it now, I'll say it again later. If you have any information about this that's verifiable, a newspaper clipping or whatever, please share it with me because, it really helps. And I'm just doing this to kind of complete the record of the hobby as it's grown from its, meager beginnings in the 60s to today. So, okay. As on one other note before I get started, this has been a long intro. As Rick, as on the forum, often points out to me, there are a bunch of sales that I don't know anything about, and so I don't include those. And in reality, there are a couple of rumored sales that would be on this list that I either can't talk about or can't verify, and so just don't include. And, so there you go. So if you're nitpicking that, I don't know everything, so this isn't the true list, it's true. I'm admitting it up front. I don't know everything. So, but I do my best and I share what I can, and we have fun. So here we go. On with it. Okay, here's a cleaner view of the visualization. I actually need to work on this a little bit to figure out how to show some of the things that I think are interesting in the data. They just don't show up anymore because the scale is so crazy. It goes from, $350 to $6 million. And so some of the things that I think are interesting don't really show up. I'll show them in this as I talk about it, but I need to come up with a new variation of this visualization. Although it does kind of show the precipitous rise that we've seen over the past decade and a half. But yeah, the vertical scale has gotten a little bit ridiculous. So. Additionally, I do use CPI inflation data to do a rough inflation adjustment. I won't dwell on the inflation adjusted prices in this video or the next one, other than to say the value of high-end comic books far outstrips inflation. I will also point out, since it's so visible, that adjusted for inflation, the eBay / Pristine Comics Action #1, CGC 9.0, that sold in 2014, is the third highest inflation-adjusted price paid for a comic book. So that sold for $3,207,852 to Metropolis, by the way, in August of 2014 on eBay. That is an inflation-adjusted $4,156,510. The Comic Connect Action 1 8.5 that sold in April of 2021 for $3,250,000. That's an inflation adjusted $3,586,000. And the Amazing Fantasy 15 sold by Heritage for $3,600,000 in September of 2021 is an inflation adjusted $3,972,993,000. So as you can see that with inflation factored in, that Pristine Comics eBay sale is still the third highest. And it was a record for a long time. It's since far been outstripped by 2 books, but I'll save that for later. It'll be in another video, but I'll save it for later. Spoilers. It's a Superman 1 and an Action 1, but I mean, hey, come on. You knew that. You're here. Maybe you didn't, and it's not really a mystery, though. You could look it up. So you're here to hear me talk about this stuff and give you funny little details. So let's move on. Let's see. Okay, so this is the interesting bit. So this is the first 39 years. So this is from 1965 until 2004, which shows the early years much more clearly. If you look at the other visualization, it just is like a flat line. But what you see here is a pattern that continues to the present day. There are clusters of records being set, followed by years of stability at the highest end of the hobby. So I'll show you what I mean. So here's the first cluster. So this is 1973 to 1977. 79, but really the cluster is 73 to 77. And then it's kind of topped off by something in 79. So the 70s, the hobby was maturing rapidly. We had, plenty of news coverage. So a lot of these sales are from like an AP article or UPI news service or whatever. The Overstreet Price Guide was maturing rapidly. So it was a pamphlet in 1970, and it was like the book that you know now, as of the second edition, third edition. I have the fourth edition somewhere here, and that just looks like all of the other guides that you've ever seen. So that was maturing rapidly. We had a central place to look for data, and the hobby was just like growing by leaps and bounds. And then that cluster, which I said is like kind of topped off by 1979, it ends with the discovery of the Edgar Church collection, which ended up producing the first book that broke $10,000 in 1979. And really, if you look at it, the hobby, like as we know it, was formalized at that point. We had pedigrees. There was a real premium attached to truly high-grade material. And many, actually, of the people that formed the foundation of the hobbies in the 80s and 90s and 2000s were already well known. In fact, some of the names are still important in the hobby today. So yeah, that's the first cluster. And then we jump ahead. There was some activity, obviously, in the 80s, but not as much. And then we had between 1990 and 1994, we had the huge comic book at the time. So the X-Force #1, X-Men #1, and Spider-Man #1. We had those guys leave Marvel to found Image Comics. And then we had Sotheby's, as I've talked about already, Sotheby's and Christie's entering the comic market with some really heavy-duty material. We also had, none of those come up here, but we also had the first, like, really stellar Silver Age pedigree. The White Mountain pedigree came out around this time. It was a really important, really exciting time for the hobby. And it produced a bunch of record books over a few years. And then, here we go. This is CGC. So this is the beginning of the CGC era. CGC, as a company, is founded January of 2000. And this little segment shows between 2000 and 2004, where we had kind of 2.5 records. So 1 record and then 2 that tied. And this is just the hobby changed kind of overnight at this point. And we didn't really see what that meant for a little while. It still had to mature. But, if you look back in hindsight, things changed at this point. I mean, obviously now, but like they really did. And it paved the way for where we're at these days. So zooming back out to the larger visualization, we now see another cluster. And this is the most exciting period I've seen in the hobby since the early 90s, which I was, not part of, but was paying attention to. I worked at a comic shop at the time. I was a dealer. I knew some reasonably well-known dealers at the time. I was working at shows all over the Northeast. I had these auction catalogs. I wasn't like going down to New York to look at them, but whatever. The period from 2010 to 2014 was like really like the most exciting time I've had in the hobby since the early 90s. And it's the most significant cluster because this is when everything really changed. So CGC had come around in 2000, and it took a decade until it really, what that meant really, came to fruition. And we started to see some of the things that I think people had been imagining were going to happen. And I had been imagining was going to happen. Like I was tracking, when is the first $1 million book going to come? When are we going to break the record set in 2003 and 2004? When are these things going to happen? And we had a period of stagnation, and then the dam burst, and things went crazy. So we broke through that stagnation in the 2000s. We broke the pay copy Flash Comics #1 record. We finally broke the $1 million barrier. And people were suddenly like, so once you broke $1 million, people were suddenly tempted to sell books that they'd been sitting on during the 2000s, where prices for the highest end books were stagnant. And this period like left our heads spinning, to be perfectly honest. It certainly kept me busy. And here we have the final cluster where the kind of COVID collectible market boom happened. But then where some collectibles died, and I've talked about how, some books that sold during that period, TMNT #1 has cratered. It sells for 40% of whatever it did in 2021. But some collectibles have not slowed down, and the highest end of the comic market has not slowed down. So we had 2 records kind of in 2021, and then we've really just blown the doors off and hit new highs, blowing through 5 million and then $6 million for a comic book, which paves the way for me wondering when we get a $10 million comic book, which is something I certainly thought was possible, which I will talk about in some videos coming up, but I didn't know when it was going to happen. And now I feel like it's on the horizon. And as you've seen with these clusters, I feel like it may be soon. I feel like somebody may be sitting on a high grade Action 1 that's been in a collection for 25 years, isn't graded, or a high end Detective 27 that isn't graded. And if you came out with a 9.0 of either of those books right now or better, I think with where we're at, I think that's a $10 million book. So, or we may stabilize. We may not see another record for another 10 years, and then we'll hit $10 million. And I will have spent the last, at that point, I will have spent the last 10 years on YouTube wondering when we're going to get a new record, which is what I was doing for the entire 2000s. So, and you can look it up. I really did. So, but let's move on. Let's look at the timeline. So the first book I have is an Action Comics #1 by an unknown seller, sometime in 1965. This is an Associated Press article. At some point in the future, I'm going to just hire somebody to source clippings for all of these early sales and actually probably just sit and research a comic book record, comic book, whatever, and just look at every comic book article between 1965 and 1980 to see if I can find any other of these special interests. Wow, comics are expensive stories. And then, so this is the one time I'm going to mention inflation. So as I mentioned, comic values have demolished inflation. This $250 purchase in 1965 is an inflation adjusted 2434 as of the making of this video, October 2024. So even if this copy was a restored 1.0 with the wrong back cover, the staples replaced, trimmed, color touched, it would be worth more than $100,000 right now. So even the worst possible copy you could have bought of Action #1 in 1965 would be worth far more than your $250 would be worth today. Okay, so now we get Marvel Comics #1. Marvel Comics #1 is a trend early on. Marvel Comics #1, you think about the period, right? This is the Marvel era, 1963, 1962, 1964, 68. All of these are seminal years in comics, and it's because of Marvel. It's because of Fantastic Four #1. It's because of Amazing Fantasy 15, Hulk 1, Daredevil, Avengers, Captain America Returns, all of these things. And then 68, of course, right around this time is the expansion of the Marvel line with Captain America standalone book, Iron Man #1, Submariner #1, the Hulk ongoing series, Captain Marvel, like all of these sort of things. So it's a big time, and Marvel was the kind of giant in the industry at this point. So Marvel #1 for a long time was one of the top, still one of the top books in the hobby, but it was ahead of what we now think of as the #1 books, which are Action Comics #1 and Detective 27. So anyway, Howard Rogowski sold this book in 1968 for $330. He was one of, if you don't know him, he was one of the earliest mail order dealers. He's often referenced alongside a guy named Robert Bell as kind of the earliest mail order dealers in, I don't know, maybe Rocket Blast Comic Collector or something. I don't have a ton of experience with the kind of pre-1970 fandom. I've owned a complete set of price guides and kind of peg my understanding of the hobby, with some exceptions, Jerry Weist or whatever, doing stuff in the 60s. But I peg my hobby from 1970 on. So these guys kind of I'm not intimately familiar with what they were doing. But so he set the record in 1968, and he was active in the hobby until 2016, when he retired and sold off the rump of his collection, which was not just comics. It was, as a lot of people that do this stuff, it was all kinds of stuff. This record was found in an AP article. So, okay. So, and this is why I want to have somebody research, because we've only got one sale in 65, one sale in 68, and then we jump to 1973. We're 3 years into the Overstreet era, and things kind of go crazy, but we broke the $1,000 barrier. And I just don't believe that we went from $330 with nothing happening in between and getting to $1,000. And in fact, I don't know if we maybe had seen $1,000 somewhere else, right? I just don't know. And there's no records that I have access to. Maybe I'll try and buy a complete set of Rockets Blast Comic Collector or some other obscure zine and try and figure out what that was. But also, I think the newspaper might be good. So, and so this was in an AP article, an Action 1 sold by Gene Henderson for $1,000 to Bruce Hamilton, which again is one of those names that you would know if you've been in the hobby for a while, in April of 1973. So $1,000 barrier is broken. And it's an Action 1, which makes sense to me. But like I said, a lot of these early books are ending up being Marvel ones. But sign of the times, or those times. Okay, so Action #1 sold by Bruce Hamilton. I don't know if it's the same one he bought. There is information about this, but I'm more focused right now on the timeline and not the story of these individual sales, because actually Mitch Mady on the CGC forum was involved in all of this. He reported on this sale, and he knows all about this stuff. But it's lore. It is, paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and I've never kind of gotten into the lore of Mitch and read all of it. So, but I do know one of his purchases because it was pretty famous. But I don't know all the details. The details are out there, and actually, this multiple people kind of talk about this stuff. So this is a video maybe I'll do. I don't know. We'll see. It'd be a lot of work. But Action #1 sold by Bruce Hamilton for $1,500 to Theo Hosteen in April of 1973, as reported by Mitch. And then there we go. So this is where Mitch kind of made his name in comics. He's still active on the forums. He has a wealth of knowledge of the early history of comics, was a big proponent of collectible comics. And, a man after my own heart with that. And from that perspective, right. Wanted comics to succeed, wanted people to see how the value of them, both monetary and artistic. So Action #1 sold by Theo Hosteen for $1,801.26 actually, but I didn't include the 26 cents. Apparently, it was $1,800 plus $1.26 for shipping, which had to have been like really expensive shipping for 1973. So Mitch bought this in 1973 May, and just over a couple of months, we went from $1,000 to $1,800. So it's pretty nuts. There he is, smiling with his Action #1. Pretty sick. That book would be worth a pretty penny right now. So I'd be smiling if I had a raw Action 1 too. Whiz #2, Riley copy, sold by Comics and Comics. That's COMICS and COMIX. Get it? For $2,000 to Burl Row in January of 1974. Things are still cooking in 1974, and we have our first pedigree book, although the hobby didn't really think of them in that way at that time. That would happen later with the church books. So I was thinking about Whiz #2, and then I thought about something else, and here I go on a tangent. Hopefully you don't hate me. Feature book 26 is likely the book that has fallen the furthest since the early days of the hobby. At one point in the mid-60s, that book, which if you don't know what it is, don't feel bad. It's a book of reprints of Hal Foster's Prince Valiant strips with a new Foster cover, his only original work for comic books. That was one of the most valuable books out there. There's like a newspaper article with like, oh, it's the best book out there, along with 2 other books I've never heard of. It was a big book though. It was still a top 20 book or so in the first Overstreet price guide. Nowadays, CGC 85 goes for around $2,500, a little less than an Action 1. All that is a preamble to say that Whiz #2 has also slid backwards, just not as precipitously. A lot of people in the early years of the hobby still had like memories of Captain Marvel, the big red cheese. And in the first top 25 or 20 or whatever it was that Overstreet published of individual books, it was listed at #3, ahead of Detective Comics #27. That was in like Overstreet 7, I think, or 8. I have my Overstreets back from storage, so I could check, but I mean, whatever. So it was in the 70s. Like Whiz #2 was #3 behind Action 1 and Marvel 1, but ahead of Detective Comics 27. Can you imagine? These days, I mean, forget it. And actually, Whiz #2 is not even in the top 10. It's still a big book, and the church copy, which sold or traded for like $176,000 in the 90s, would sell for a bunch of money if it came up for auction or sale or whatever. But, it was at one point, it was ahead of Action 1, Detective 27, or right in that level. Now, it's not even in the same, Action 2 is ahead of it. Action 7 is ahead of it. Captain America #1, Superman #1, bunch of books. So, interesting. But it made it onto the list, actually. And it would make it onto the alternative list of books that hit a value, didn't sell for money, but, it trade value because of that $176,000 of trade that it did in the 90s. So, okay, now we're back to Action #1. So Mitch sold one of his undercopies of Action #1 in 1975. This was in an AP article, and I'm sure Mitch mentioned it on the boards as well. So it's something to check out if I ever do that deep dive into Mitch lore video. This one's from a local paper, Boston Globe. Motion Picture Funnies Weekly at this time was newly discovered. It's still exceedingly rare, and was thought of at the time was like, oh, this is the first appearance of Submariner. It's not Marvel Comics #1. Nowadays, it's obviously a rare and collectible book, but in terms of long-term prospects, this is maybe the worst purchase of the whole list. $6,000 is now $33,963 as of 2024, and the last one I saw, high grade one, was in 2004 for like 40 grand. So a nice copy, the pay copy, would sell for, maybe $150,000 at this point. But like compared to the return you would get on a high grade Action 1 from this period, it's kind of a rough purchase. But at the time, it was like Overstreet called it a bombshell. Nowadays it's an interesting novelty or footnote or whatever, and really like a collector's book, but like, not quite world record level. Here's the clipping. So when I initially saw this clipping, it said first Submariner, first appearance of Submariner. I said, wow, Marvel Comics #1. And I had listed it as a Marvel Comics #1, and it was Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, which came up on the board. So thank the forums again. So okay, so we're getting close to the end of this particular video. We have price guide number 8, the 1977 market report, listing a Marvel Comics #1 selling out of Canada for $7,500. So we think it's Robert Crystal. That was a big Canadian dealer at the time, for a long time after that. This is 1977. So we're about to get to one of the big milestones. Obviously, we've jumped a lot from $250 to $7,500, and really, from just $1,000 at the beginning of 1973 to now $7,500. We've moved pretty quickly. And again, it's Marvel Comics #1. And even Motion Picture Funnies Weekly was a Marvel book. It was exciting, like, first Submariner. That's so exciting. So we're going to continue that trend with the last book in this video, which is why it's the March to 10,000. I think I said there were going to be 2 videos in this series. There may still be. It depends on how long the next one's going to take. But this has taken a while. So, and $10,000, breaking the $10,000 barrier is a pretty big deal. So we may end up here. And this is really a turning point in the hobby. So in 1979, as reported in Overstreet Price Guide number 10, a copy of Marvel Comics #1 sold for $13,500. This is the church copy. So this is during the first round of when the books were being sold. I had actually never noted this as the church copy previously. So this is one of those things that I talked about where like I've discovered new information just recently. Additionally, this was Steve Geppi, who was on Chuck's first call list for books being, dispersed from the church collection as Chuck was selling the books to the hobby. So Geppi was on the list, but he brokered the deal for John Snyder. So John Snyder actually ended up with the book. This is the first world record for this book. There's another one coming up, spoilers. And additionally, it would go on later, which I'll talk about, to be the first book valued at $100,000. No spoilers on that, but eventually in the 80s, it would be valued at 100 grand. And so I just recently discovered this, as I talked about in a video. I've been doing some research, trying to figure out some information. I found the first sale that we'll talk about in the next video in an Overstreet price guide. It wasn't on the list, and I started talking on the forums, and I've kind of chipped away and come to this sale and realized that it was a church copy. So we've broken $10,000. It took, I don't know, half an hour, however long this video is going to be when I edit it down. And we've gone from $250 to $10,000. And next video will be at least $10,000 to $100,000, maybe $10,000 to $1 million, $5 million, $6 million. We'll figure it out. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride. As you can tell, I've been like really interested in this topic. I've gone on a few tangents. I may continue to do so as we go forward. So thanks for checking out this video. Thanks for sticking with me if you've made it this far. Please like, subscribe if you haven't, share with your friends, and I'll see you in the next one.